All right. Welcome to yet another edition of the Grim Wisdom Podcast. With me once again is Eliza Scher, dear friend of mine, psychotherapist. Psychotherapist? What?
Psychotherapist.
Yeah. She's not actually psycho. She's just a therapist, so I don't know why.
As far as you know.
You append the prefix. Well, I know you pretty well, and, I mean, maybe you're dismembering other people in the basement, but you haven't killed me yet. So, anyway, the idea as always is we're going to...
just made you stronger.
Well, I'll drink to that.
Yeah.
Cheers. The idea as always is we're going to bring you some wisdom, and you're not going to enjoy it. Eliza thought that as a good compliment to our dark conversation, we're going to have some really dark beer. So,
yes.
This is like some potent beer here. So, if we get a little silly here...
You'll know why.
Yeah, you'll know why. It's not because we're buffoons who don't really know very much. It's because we've been drinking.
The beer will bring out our inner buffoons.
Yes, exactly. I think honestly that's probably a good place to start. Is that deep down we're all fools at heart.
That's why I love you. You're comfortable with your inner fool.
It's true.
And I strive to be comfortable with my inner fool, so I look up to you in that way.
Well, I think we all have to. I think a foundational principle of my philosophy, one of the building blocks of who I am, is that at home, back in that small town I grew up in Oregon, my parents had on the side of the stand-up freezer. They had like a separate freezer out in the garage. Anyway, every time you go out to the garage, you'd see this hanging, and it's Garfield and Odie, and they both have pie all over their faces, having clearly just each thrown a pie in the other's faces, and they're both pointing at the other and laughing. And the caption reads, "We all must learn to laugh at ourselves."
That's a great message.
Hey, yeah. I mean, Garfield, there's some grim wisdom for you.
In my household, it was be perfect or be in peril. And that's not a very comfortable way to grow up. That's how I felt anyway. I mean, I think my brother and sister would probably have a different narrative about it, but that was definitely the message that I felt. It wasn't necessarily the message given overtly, but it was kind of the subtext, the emotional message, maybe not the overt message.
Well,
I
the
think it's
emotional
much
message
healthier.
is more important. It's more a deeper impact on how you,
Definitely.
But what do you say?
I think what you grew up with is a lot healthier. The idea of being comfortable laughing at yourself it's a great one.
Well,
Very healthy.
I do want to say my I guess 12 or so listeners now. One of them is definitely my mom, and so my mom is listening to this.
Are you saying this is the Last Supper? Is that what you're saying?
Well,
makes you.
Only in the sense that at the end of it, someone's gonna die.
You're the guy who's about to be crucified. Okay? I just wanted to point that out.
Well, maybe I'm the guy that sneaks off. I mean, haven't you those conspiracy theories about how there was the Mary Magdalene was the extra apostle, but only she didn't appear in the picture. She got away.
Wow.
Yeah.
No, I never heard that because I'm a Jew, so we don't really care.
Right. I mean, who gives a It's just a story anyway. But I like to think of myself as the Mary Magdalene who was smart enough to get out before the picture, right, and who gets no cred.
It's kind of perfect for you.
Yeah. That's my...
And I love the whole gender bendery thing that you sneaked in there. That's really satisfying.
Well, we're all human, right? I mean, what are women supposed to identify with? There's no female apostle, so I figure except for Mary Magdalene, who's not on the canon, so I figure if they all have to bend their gender, then it's only fair, equal time.
What a good feminist.
Anyway, I was going to say, so thanks for my mom, who's I'm sure listening, who was never afraid to laugh at me when the situation warranted it, for teaching me that, we should all learn to laugh at ourselves. Anyway, but I don't want to have too many warm fuzzies about family and upbringing, because that's not what this is about. If we're not bringing you down...
Let's get some grimness here.
Right. Well, we're drinking beer, and you can't have any, so that's pretty grim, right? And it's good beer,
it's some good stuff. Yeah. You guys should be jealous.
Be jealous, listeners. So, we should probably start approaching the point. Okay. You mentioned a minute ago about narratives. I thought, really, one of the reasons I wanted to have you back on the podcast is because you were willing to do it again, which...
That's pretty much everything.
Hey, meet the low bar, right? No, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast again was because I really enjoyed our conversation. I think I got a lot of feedback about yours from the 5 listeners I had at the time about your show because some people were like, oh, I didn't like it at all. It was a departure from the normal tone, and people were like, oh, I thought it was really great. So there was this. I like that you're a polarizing figure. I want to have more of those on the show.
Yes, well, I'm sure my positivity doesn't fit in, so
No, not at all.
I can be comfortable with that.
I think you have. I think deep inside behind all of your veneer of civilized, professional optimism, as it were, you have a very, very dark heart at the core of you. I think.
Oh,
you could.
not sure. I
You could
accept.
find it within yourself to be grim and bitter. I mean, let's put it that way. So.
I'll have to think about that.
I want to inspire you to get in touch with that part
I
of
think
yourself.
I can understand that part of the human experience.
can.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's really where I am, way down deepest at the core, but
Well,
there are a few circles of hell in there where I can identify with that, and I've lived through that. So
I mean, I think every human being has to. If you don't understand what misery is, then I feel sorry for you. And if you don't understand anything but misery, I feel sorrier for you. Because I feel like, if you live a life without misery, it must mean you're sheltered. Because I think most people that engage with the world, the totality of existence, must be miserable at some point or another. Wouldn't you agree?
yeah, or else I think you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'm sure you deal with miserable people on a daily basis, so that must be,
A lot of misery.
yeah. Yeah. So,
Yep.
I don't want to tell you that misery is fundamental, but clearly you understand it. Let's put it that way.
Oh, I think it is. I mean, I think it's a big part of the change process for people. You have to kind of hit bottom in your own particular way before you're willing to do anything different or
Yeah.
able to do anything different sometimes.
Like
But
the bottom of a beer glass, for example.
like we were saying last time, too much misery can just make it impossible for people. So I guess it's the right amount of misery.
Well, I think I'd agree with that. I think more the way that I strive for in my personal development is not directly to experience less misery, but to just increase my ability to withstand misery, and that it's more of like a focus on not so much denying weakness, but developing strength to endure your weaknesses, I guess, is the way I would put it. Because I
Yeah.
think that we're all
I really see that in you.
in you, Grant.
No, I do, and I admire it. I do look up to you in that way.
Aw.
That you're, I think that there's this American ideal where we're all supposed to be happy, and it can turn into this kind of Stepford kind of ideal where any kind of misery or sadness or complication is sort of shunned, that people are afraid to even acknowledge that that's part of what they're going through. And I really admire people like you who, can own it. And, I also think that there are many stretches of life where happiness is beyond reach, and that Americans are not realistic about that. And there are other places in the world where people are more realistic about that, and they're actually happier. Like they've mastered that paradox of that you can be happier by accepting where you are. And that, I know that sounds like a lot of new age fluff, but I think that when things are really difficult, and if you're able to find that core of acceptance and able to tolerate it, like you're saying, that I really strive for that myself, because I think there are a lot of passages in life that are very difficult where that's basically the only relief that's available to people, is to just try to just stay with what's going on and find a way to be with it. And I think that you do that.
Well, thank you, Liz. I always like to hear my virtues, such as they are extolled. So thank you for that, as we clink glasses. I think they say happiness is expectations realized, but the secret to happiness is not having low expectations, or it's not just having low expectations, right? Certainly, setting expectations that are not wildly unrealistic is, I think, a vital component of happiness, but one thing I sometimes like to joke with people that I never expect anything to turn out well, so I'm always pleased.
But don't you think that there's a pressure in our country that starts with this idea of the pursuit of happiness, and you combine it with the materialism of capitalism, where people feel like if they're not completely happy, they're failing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something really wrong with that.
Well, I think you can go back to, I think I mentioned this on the podcast before, but one of the interesting things is in the Declaration of Independence, which I guess we all know the preamble, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that nonsense. But then in the Constitution, when it came time to actually codify those rights into a document that was a governing document, they replaced pursuit of happiness with property, including property as defined as, human bodies at the time, right? So.
Whoa, that's intense.
Yeah. So you're talking about something that is written into the fundamental DNA of American culture, right? Is, if you want to, I think it's fair to extrapolate from that because the phrasing is very similar in the Constitutional Declaration. The only thing that's been changed, like I said, is pursuit of happiness has been replaced by property. Mm-hmm. So if you look
I actually didn't know that.
If you look at the context of the times, well, because nobody reads the Constitution. It's funny because we all read the Declaration, or at least the preamble, because the Declaration is short, and the Declaration expresses what we would like to believe our values are, right? Whereas the Constitution is a significantly longer document. It's the result of some sausage making and compromise, and it very much reflects that. It's not as readable or fun of a document, but it is readable. I mean, if you've read any writing from that time, it's funny how readable people in the 18th century were, really, when you get right down to it. I mean, they just didn't write or speak all that different than we do today. So it's not as if one can't read the Constitution. It's not like Shakespeare, for example, where you almost have to learn a variant of English in order to decipher original Shakespeare, right? But the Constitution, it can be read. It's readily available, but people usually only read the Bill of Rights, and they only really read the amendments that they care most about, generally the first and the second, and that's about it, right?
I don't know if I've ever read either. I mean, I know I came across some of the language in my studies, before college, but I'm not actually sure I don't think I've ever read either of those documents.
Well, I do think it's instructive. Not that I want to tell everybody to read them because, as I've commented on before, I don't want this podcast to be an endless list of things that you should read or media that you should consume that obviously you never will. But I do think it's instructive because it really highlights the hypocrisy and the unrealistic nature of American expectations. I mean, modern feminists, black studies people, lots of people have written Native studies about how the Constitution was designed to place rich white men at the pinnacle to have their hands on the reins. And that's to be expected because it was written by rich white men. But the idea that they wrote this Constitution with their own narrow interests in mind, and they were willing to compromise on what should have been fundamental principles like slavery and so on, just to make sure that they would continue to have power, I do think is worth contemplating. I think that one of the things that we don't talk about enough, or that we don't really discuss enough, and that those disciplines which I've named have begun to address, is that the American culture really was written with that in mind. It was designed with that in mind. It wasn't explicitly designed to keep women as property, but effectively the Constitution protected their status as property. It was explicitly written with slavery in mind, to the extent that the Constitution mentions slavery and discusses slavery both directly and indirectly throughout. So when you think about Americans' noble ideals and our various pretensions, it really does sort of depress you. If you want to find a source of grim wisdom, that's definitely it. If you read the Constitution and then you compare that to what
Yeah, if you
our
really
ideals are.
force yourself to confront what they're really saying.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
not put your kind of idealistic spin on it and turn it into more of a fairy tale.
And it's so tempting to turn it into a fairy tale because, and that dovetails nicely into the other thing we wanted to talk about today, which is constructing narratives, because that is a socially constructed narrative
Yeah.
of the formation of this country. It was designed very, very consciously to make you feel patriotic and proud,
Yeah.
and very consciously to brush over all the many, many sticking points
Yeah.
in American history of times when we warred on people out of pure greed or racism,
Yeah.
when we committed genocide or other things.
I
And
read
that-
a pretty provocative article about that recently that a friend of mine posted to Facebook about how
I love, by the way,
our-
sorry to interrupt this, I love how so much human wisdom is, I read an article on Facebook. Continue.
well, someone happened to post it, that basically that our politicians are people who perpetuate these narratives, but the actuality of what is actually happening in our society is a world apart from those, the soaring rhetoric of Obama. As much as I love Obama, I know you're more critical of him than I am, but that there's a real chasm between the narratives that the politicians sell about this country and then the reality of the life that people are leading. I just thought that was pretty interesting.
Well, I think, Obama, to be honest, it's interesting that you say that, because I don't think we actually disagree on any fundamental factual point. It's just that, two things, you're slightly less far to the left than I am.
I'm definitely more centrist in certain
Yeah.
ways, yeah.
Yeah, so you're definitely more centrist.
You know why, though?
I didn't want to say to the right of me, because to me, if somebody said
Thank
you're
you
to
for
the-
not saying that.
Yeah, I would consider that a mortal insult.
Yes,
I mean, that
it
would
is.
be
It
pistols
totally
to pawn, but not as far to the left.
It was almost as bad as when a student accused me of liking Kenny G. That was I think
Wow.
the low point in my
Wow.
life. But and he didn't know that I knew how badly he was insulting me. Oh, was I pissed?
Although I saw a couple of funny Saturday Night Live sketches with Kenny G, so I think the guy at
Well,
least.
that redeems him.
Well, he has a sense of humor
Well,
about
that's
it, which
good.
is nice. It's
Coming
good
back
to
to
see.
your original vignette,
Right,
about
at least-
the pie in the face.
Right, at least he
Yeah.
can laugh at himself, like him and Michael Bolton, who
Yeah,
clearly capable of humor at their own expense, which I definitely, that is a trait that goes a long way to redeem a person, to be honest.
yeah.
But yeah, since you're not quite as far to the left as I am, and then
You know why? It's because I'm afraid of chaos. I'm afraid of anarchy. I like social order because I'm afraid of what happens when there isn't. So that's why I fear radical solutions. I'm afraid of too much change too quickly. I am more of an incrementalist that way, like Mrs. Clinton, which I know is not cool to say, but I'm coming out about it.
not cool, man.
It's like there are a lot of people who are closeted about their support for her because she's not a sexy or exciting figure, but I like social order because I think it protects all of us, but I understand that it also comes at the expense of the welfare of a lot of people, and that's
Yes.
the problem.
Yes, and it's how do you resolve that contradiction? And I think it's perfectly okay to come out as being pro-Clinton. I don't think it's, there's not so much of a stigma for it, I think, at this point.
Well, I've gotten chewed out on Facebook for posting pro-Clinton articles.
Well, people on Facebook are petty dicks, if you'll forgive my saying so. I mean, a lot of times the problem is that if you post an article, you're to some degree, and this is getting a little far afield, but if you post an article, you're to some degree, any criticism that this article is inane and stupid may be deserved, because you are, after all, using yourself as a mouthpiece
Sure.
to repeat an article. So, not that you wrote it, but if the article is dumb, then that
Well,
is something that you deserve to be held to account somewhat for.
The articles I've posted are mostly about the hidden misogyny in the way that Clinton is perceived by the electorate. And I think that that's something that really people need to be continually reminded of that, because I think it's so unconscious. And, I'm torn between whether she would be beloved if she was a male candidate or if she'd be more like a Mitt Romney. She'd be so boring that nobody would be interested in her. The fact that she's a woman might be the only thing that excites people about her, because she does seem like pretty ho-hum in every other way. But I do think that she's subjected to far harsher criticisms and critiques simply because she's female. And I don't think that's acknowledged enough. So the articles I posted have been about that.
And I think that's perfectly fair and valid. I do think it's a little bit frustrating that she understands this and she pushes it as hard as she possibly can. Like, you should vote for me because I'm a woman.
I think that's a sign of the times because she ignored it. She tried to just downplay that
Right.
in 08. And I think it's great that we've reached a point where now it's an asset. That actually excites me, that she can now use that and it's a positive.
Well, the way I look at it is, not that Hillary Clinton is evil, so I'm not quite going that far.
Yeah,
But
don't
let's
do
say,
it Donald Trump because he's
Yeah.
trying that narrative.
But it's like, I want to use evil versus evil as an analogy,
Okay,
not as a
okay.
direct correlation here. So,
Flavors of evil. Okay,
yeah.
I'm
So
with
let's
you.
take Julian Assange, right? Who is currently,
Mhm.
he's a WikiLeaks guy. If you don't know,
Yeah.
he's a WikiLeaks guy. Chelsea Manning, back when she was Bradley Manning, leaked him a bunch of documents. Basically, did a data dump of a lot of information from the military's computers, and some of it I think was really valuable to the public and really important for people to know and really important to be released. And some of it was not at all important to be released. And stuff like the personal opinions of U.S. diplomats on the character of various heads of state, right? That stuff is confidential for a reason, because if my diplomat over in Russia thinks, hey, this guy is a D-bag, right? I need to know that as the person, as an executive here, stateside. I need to know my diplomat thinks he is a D-bag, right? But that can't be made public because it causes an international incident to no purpose, right? And so I think that sort of thing was in the data dump, and I think that it's very clear to me that Chelsea Manning was just leaking a bunch of information without the ability to filter it, right? And trusted, perhaps foolishly, in this Julian Assange guy to filter, which he didn't at all. In fact, I think that he took pleasure in the salacious, in the ruining of the careers of diplomats, among other things, simply because it brought him more notoriety, right? And so he is currently bunkered up in an embassy, I think in London, I forget exactly where. But
Or
this-
Sweden?
no, well, the Swedes want him, right?
Oh, the Swedes want him on a sexual assault charge.
Right. The Swedes want him on a sexual assault charge, and it's a no-win situation because it seems
Does he
clear.
have to pay rent at the embassy
I
since
don't
he's living there?
I don't know. That's a good question, but I don't know. I don't know how it works with these people, but it's a problem because I don't feel any particular compassion for him at all, right? I mean, it's clear to me looking at the details of the sexual assault case that he did something wrong. It's also clear to me that the thing that he did wrong does not deserve a life sentence, right? It's clear to me that he has no interest in the American, in the actual health of the American democracy. He's only interested in his own aggrandizement, right?
That's what I was wondering, if you think he's just on a power trip.
Yeah, I think
We're
he's
kind of implying
absolutely. I mean,
He's enjoying that.
I think if you see him on TV or you listen to him, it's hard to avoid that conclusion. The guy is so smug. He doesn't come off as Snowden. I think Snowden is a little invested in thinking that he's smarter than you, but I think also Snowden is acting from a place of true conviction, rather than where Julian Assange.
It's a pretty big sacrifice he made, Snowden.
He did, and he didn't do it.
He's young, that's
Right.
a long time. That's a very young age to basically give yourself a life sentence.
Yeah, and it didn't.
Exile.
And unlike Julian Assange, it didn't put him in a position where he could commit sexual assault because of his personal fame. Because, to the best of my knowledge, Snowden has a girlfriend that he's committed to. So
Is she with him in Russia?
I think so. I think they eventually got her out. But anyway,
So-
the point is, Snowden is a much more sympathetic figure to me. Julian Assange, I don't like the guy. I think he's pretty much garbage, who's interested in his own fame. But at the same time, I don't think he's done anything that warrants a life sentence. I don't think any sane observer thinks that the instant he's at embassy, the U.S. won't black bag him, send him to Gitmo, and torture him to death. They certainly will. There'll be no trial. There'll be no justice for him if he leaves that embassy.
Right.
And so it's like,
Interesting.
I am placed in a very awkward position because I don't want to defend a man who I find to be kind of contemptible and who certainly deserves some sort of punishment for a sex crime. Although it's interesting too that people will downplay the sex crime because technically it wouldn't be a sex crime in America, and it effing should be, right? Bottom line is when he was having casual sex with some women, and this is kind of a nasty detail, so forgive me, but when he was having casual sex with these women, they asked him to use protection. He argued with them. They insisted.
Not cool.
They insisted, and he essentially tricked them so that he didn't have to wear a condom. Right?
That's a
and then
sex crime.
on one occasion,
That's terrible.
a woman was having intercourse with him after just waking up, and there were some consent issues involved. So yeah, I mean, something was done to their body that they didn't consent to. It's messed up, right? But at the same time, like, there's certainly worse things that could have happened to them. It's not a crime that deserves a life sentence, right? So, as
Not a life
reprehensible,
sentence,
no, I don't think he deserves to be taken to Gitmo and waterboarded to death, right? With no possibility of trial. And it's at least possible, although I think it's quite unlikely, it's possible that he's innocent.
Well, maybe
right?
he'll get lucky and Obama will be able to close Gitmo, and then you won't have to worry.
Well, I mean, I think if you're dreaming of that, dream on, right?
Good point.
Obama promised he
Point
would.
taken.
He's promised in every state of the union his entire presidency.
But I
Gitmo's
think
still open.
He's gotten
And if
the
you think
population
Hillary
down
Clinton-
to like 50 people
He's-
from
he's-
like 600.
I will grant you that he made, I think, a fair effort, but in a lot of cases,
And you know what? Even if he had closed Gitmo, he would be under so much harsh criticism for that. He can't win. He can't win on this.
yes, that's America's favorite
That's
game.
America, yeah.
You can't win. So, but this isn't, this is
Same
getting
thing
kind
with
of,
Syria.
this is, oh yeah, absolutely. But it's like Syria, there's no win. The whole thing is so horrifying.
Yeah.
But this is all getting far afield from
Yeah.
what
We're
I
not
wanted
really
to
on
talk
the
about. No, we're not really on the point. I wanted to talk about narratives,
Tell me.
and we got sidetracked by all of this. But it is interesting because
Well, it is the political season, so
it is,
very
and
interested in that.
one thing before actually we get back to narratives, there's one other piece of new political news that I wanted to mention. So, I wrote a piece that actually got into the war
I
with
saw
Beacon.
that.
Yay!
Yay!
Where I told people not to vote for the endorsed candidates, the starred candidates.
That's a very important piece of information.
Yeah, because I don't think people know what that indicates. And if you haven't read the article, you can find it on RI Future. I'll post a link to it in the comments of this when I post this podcast. But the point is, there's a formal endorsement process. People that get endorsed get a bunch of free resources that ordinary people running for office can't get or they have to pay extra for. And the endorsement process is hopelessly corrupt. And I talked about that a little bit, and there's been a couple of developments that I wanted to mention. First of all, here's a funny one for you. So I got a letter I didn't personally get a letter, but I came into my possession a letter that was sent out to a bunch of voters in Pawtucket because it seems that one of the city candidates didn't get the star at the end of his name that he was supposed to get. So the Secretary of State had already mailed out a bunch of ballots off the star. Oh my gosh. So the Secretary of State sent all these people new ballots and said, you can use this new ballot, and if you've already sent your ballot in, definitely send in this new one. So the strong implication of the letter is that if you've already voted, your vote won't count because you didn't have the opportunity to benefit from seeing that freaking star on a piece of paper. And not to mention, the voters who get mail ballots are often people with disabilities or older folks, where the cost of even a postage stamp is an expense they would rather not incur, right? And so it's 2 postage stamps. And then too, this was all, of course, the new ballots come at taxpayer expense, right? So why is this?
I was wondering about that.
Why is this such an important piece of information that the ballots had to be resubmitted? Well, it's an important piece of information because it decides elections. And because these are petty, egomaniacal people who care a lot about the star. I mean, the guy already got the free resources that come with the star. The only thing he didn't get is the star on the ballot. It's literally it. But he was apparently such a baby. He insisted on reprinting the ballots to make sure. And anybody that didn't vote for him disallowed their ballots. Is the strong implication of the letter. And I posted that on my Facebook page when it came into my possession. I got it from David Norton, who's been on a podcast before. Also, I suppose I'll link to that. I don't want to make too many promises. Well, I suppose I'll link to that in the comments of this podcast as well. So that was one piece of interesting news that came out this week, and I wanted to touch on that. And another interesting piece of news is that I mentioned, without naming him, the guy that dispenses the stars, who is a puppet of Mattiello. It's a guy who's just a sign. Well, this Mattiello puppet, he penned an op-ed in which he described Mattiello as leading the charge for ethics reform, which is such a ludicrous thing to say. Like, literally everyone in the state that doesn't work in the State House knows that Mattiello opposed the ethics reform, has done everything he can to sabotage it, and is now insisting on that only cover 3 months out of every 4 because he wants 90 days before every election where they can't investigate, can't do anything. That way, if any candidate does happen to be found guilty of an ethical violation, there'll always have to be a special election for him and give the machine time to replace him with a new tool candidate.
Chosen puppet, yeah.
Right. Instead of election season where it's like 9 days before an election when I declare that I'm running for office, that's when I'm going to be doing my opposition research. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm not going to be doing my opposition research 2 years in advance when the Ethics Commission is allowed to investigate. Mm-hmm. Right? And so it's important information that the voters need to know. It's most important before an election, but Mattiello doesn't want he has to be seen to be in favor of this because he's had so many high-profile buddies of his go down in the last year for blatant ethical violations. So he can't oppose it publicly anymore, but he still clearly wants to undermine it, and he worked very hard for many years to stop it from going forward. So to call him a leader at the forefront is such a despicable example of fake narrative construction. I thought it was worth mentioning. I'm going to try to write a letter to the editor if I have time.
So we're juxtaposing these political narratives, which are, done for expedience, versus personal narratives, which, in my field, we hope to free people from the expedient narratives that keep them oppressed and help them find a narrative that helps them feel more liberated.
Isn't that exactly what we're talking about, though? Because that's exactly what I want to do in the political realm, is free people from expedient narratives.
Exactly.
Right.
And maybe, so you're trying to raise awareness, help educate people about what these expedient narratives are. So that's a stepping stone to people creating narratives that serve them better, that actually serve their interests. So it's like a great example of that is how poor white people often vote Republican.
Yeah, right.
That's like the classic thing of people accepting a narrative that actually perpetuates a system that comes at their expense. Mm-hmm. Because they're buying this whole idea of patriotism that serves them, but the programs that are enacted really don't. So it's interesting.
Yes, I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, that's the pool of people from whom, them and, poor blacks and poor minorities, but also to a large extent poor whites who have been raised on a diet of patriotism. Yeah. Those are the people that go off to war and get killed.
A diet of Fox News.
Right.
And that's a big problem, is these media outlets that manufacture these narratives and make them readily available, and the schism between the different media outlets and how people only are on a diet of one or the other. Mm-hmm. And that can be a real problem. I mean, I think of it as brainwashing. I don't know how you think of it, but,
I use the phrase programming, but it comes to the same thing. Yeah.
But if you're not partaking from both sides and really listening deeply to both sides, and trying to sort through what's the propaganda and what's the reality, or finding people to listen to who maybe have a different political affiliation from you, but maybe aren't so invested in programming you, but just have a different point of view. I think that's really a really important part of this whole thing, to come up with a narrative that's more credible, instead of one that, just makes you like a tool of this political machine, whichever political machine you happen to be allied with, whether it's the right or the left.
And I would respond to that because in my analogy, there's no safe amount of lead in drinking water, right? The ideal amount is 0.
Yes.
Right? There's no safe amount of poison to drink of some poisons, right? And for venoms, right? For animal venoms, for things that exist naturally, for naturally occurring venoms, right? You can actually develop an immunity to the harmful effects of the venom over time by exposing yourself to steadily increasing doses. Your body can fight it off, and it's a thing
Yes.
that people who work in zoos and who
Until
have-
until it finally kills you.
No, actually, your body has an immune response to the venom. It neutralizes it.
Oh, is that
You
right?
train your body, yes, but the
Wow.
immune response it never becomes innate. You need to constantly expose yourself to the venom. So it's not cost effective to do for people just as a precautionary thing unless they're involved in working with
Yeah.
venomous insects or
Wow.
reptiles, right? Like for example, beekeepers become immune to bee venom because they're
Right.
stung so much, right? People that
Mental
work with
health
snakes.
workers probably we get immune in some way to misery, maybe.
Yeah.
Or
So
manipulation or whatever the hard things are.
So naturally occurring poisons that have their true place in the world,
In the ecosystem.
you can condition yourself to be immune to them over time, right? And so it might even be to your benefit to consume a healthy diet of a small amount of natural poison.
Hence the podcast.
Yeah,
But let me ask you something.
I like that. That's good.
Is it also like an allergy where your body can reach a tipping point where all of a sudden it's like, no way, and all of a sudden it just gets really vulnerable to that venom?
It's possible. I mean, it could be. I think it's the kind of thing where it depends on person to person, just like allergies and other immune response things. But
Right.
by and large, there's going to be a few people, yeah, where that'll happen. But by and large, I think most people can handle it over time. And just like most people, if you, no matter how allergic you are to dogs, for example, you can get unallergic by taking allergy shots.
That's interesting, yeah.
So the
it's
point
an
of
inoculation. Yeah.
right. The point is, you can condition yourself over time to be resistant to natural poisons. But industrial poisons are a different thing. A synthetic poison created in a lab to kill you,
Ooh.
you might never be able, there might be no amount of that is good for you, like
Yeah.
lead and water.
Right.
And so what I'm proposing is that Fox News is not a natural,
Yes.
organic expression
Right.
of a true political philosophy.
There you go.
It is a synthetic poison that is engineered to destroy your brain,
Yeah.
right? And so the ideal
It's a
consumption of it.
distortion.
Right. You know, there's certainly different voices. There are voices of people who are understandably reluctant to change. I think it's very valid to have a healthy dialogue between people who
But
are.
it's so rare to find now.
It
It
is.
is so difficult to find an actual dialogue between left and right.
Because all the moderate
But that's
Republicans
what
have
we
been
need.
shot.
That's what we need.
All of the people who are on the right, who are arguing in good faith, have been systematically rooted out and destroyed.
By like the Tea Party. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And, well,
It's
by the Tea
terrible.
Party, which is itself
But
synthetic, right?
so
Which is the result of astroturfing and years of Fox News.
some of my friends have been saying that Donald Trump is like the natural conclusion of that, and that this could create a way for those voices to come back in because he's really destroying what the Republican Party has become. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
No, I just think he's a mirror.
Yeah,
I think when you're
he totally is.
hideous, but you're the king, everyone's afraid to call you hideous, but you might break mirrors. Oscar Wilde wrote, like in the picture of Dorian Gray, right, where the guy, where he wished that he could forever that the picture could age and that he would remain
Right.
changeless like the picture, and he got his wish. And so over time, like the cumulative weight of his sins and years turned the picture into this distorted visage of age and evil, right? Whereas he remained young and beautiful.
Ooh, I like that.
Right.
That's a good analogy.
And
Really good.
it got to be where the picture terrified him, and he did everything he could to hide the picture from everyone, right? When at first he was proud of it because it was a good likeness, right? And he hid it in, a part of his house where no one was allowed to go. And eventually he looked at it, and the sight of himself, of that true vision of what he would look like, was so loathsome that he couldn't help himself but destroy the picture, which also killed him, right? And I think that's what you're seeing with the modern Republican Party, is they've come to this point. You know, I've often said about Donald Trump, even if he goes away, even if we defeat him, a lot of people feel a lot of urgency about defeating him. His base is still going to be there.
Well, they're saying that he's just using this run as a way to start a media empire, and he's going to make billions, and he'll have 40 million followers, and
Yeah,
he'll
he's
have
just
a
trolling.
bully, he'll have a bully
Retention.
pulpit of his
Yeah.
own. And,
But-
yeah,
I mean, who really knows? I don't care about the end game of Donald Trump. I'm not that interested in it anymore. I mean, I've said all along, I think he's just trolling. I still wouldn't be surprised if he endorsed Clinton tomorrow. But
wow, that would be something else.
I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but it wouldn't surprise me if before the election he did,
Wow,
just for the media coverage it would get.
that's amazing.
You know, and I've also tried to explain that, like,
Talk about a coronation. That would
Yeah.
really be something.
and I've said on the podcast before, you know, Clinton, the husband, appointed his sister to the federal bench.
Yes, right. I remember
So-
that.
You know, what does it matter to me which of them nominates Trump's sister, who's a Republican, by the way? So what does Bill Clinton have to do nominating Republicans to the federal bench?
Well,
And
he
if
was
Bill
very
Clinton-
centrist.
Yeah, and if Bill Clinton would do it, why wouldn't Hillary? There's no
Yeah.
reason. You know, there's all these pictures
She's
of
pretty
us together.
centrist too.
Yeah, so, you know, this expectation that, oh, we should care about the Supreme Court. And even then, too, if the Supreme Court tomorrow unmade Citizens United, that would not be sufficient to keep money out of politics. It wouldn't cure American democracy. You know, they were doing
Why not?
fundraisers. They were doing fundraisers for Hillary where people could contribute $300,000 to Hillary legally without going through Citizens United, without using PACs. And the way they did it was they write a $300,000 check, and that check gets kicked back to all the state parties.
It goes to like the DNC.
It goes to the national party. There's a
Yeah.
limit to the national party. There's a limit to state parties. You know, there's a limit to the territory parties. There's a limit to Clinton herself. That $300 and some odd $1,000 check, it goes to all those people who then kick it back up to the Clinton campaign, who
Oh.
essentially launder the money for the Clinton campaign to get around campaign finance. This is perfectly legal, all done out in the open. Nobody talks about it, but
Talk about grim wisdom.
yeah. So if you think that it's one Supreme Court case away from being a fixed campaign finance system, let me cure you of that glowing ignorance right now and give you some grim wisdom. It's not. It's not going to make that big of a difference, right? So, you know, on the national level, we talk about, because you don't really have to deal with this. That's one of the things about this. Maybe it happens occasionally in rare and exotic situations, but most of the time, it seems like you're dealing with organic narratives, right? Where people either devise them for themselves as a means of expediently dealing with some misery, or you're trying to help correct them into a new narrative of themselves and their lives, right? But there's no analog to industrial poison in the narratives that you deal with, right? And so I think that I really wanted to talk about, because obviously we spend a lot of time talking about political matters and politics, but grim wisdom shouldn't just be about that. It should be about personal development, right? And in your own personal development, most of the narratives that you're going to have in your life are going to be organically generated. They're going to have their natural place in the world, even if they're toxic, right? And so they can be dealt with in a normal way. So I wanted to bring you on to talk about that. But it is, I think, also true. It's like the limits of it's where the analogy breaks down, because you don't have to deal with that. Or do you? I mean, do you ever deal with like an artificially imposed narrative from outside?
Oh God, yes.
Well, tell me about that. Let's talk
Okay,
about that.
so I have and I might have even talked. This client might have come up the last time. One client case that springs to mind is somebody who was raised in a very traditional Catholic family,
Mm-hmm.
and the parents were, just like the church, extremely authoritarian. Like, they were the source of all wisdom, and there was no flexibility in them. Like, it was basically very rigid. Like, this is the truth, this is right and wrong, it's the way we see it, and you have to fit yourself to that. So we expect you to just go along to get along and not have any reactions or feelings about what might be going on in the family. Your job is to just be a team player and kind of suck it up no matter what's going on, regardless of whatever trauma you might be experiencing, or, this person went through a lot of hard times and basically had to deal with it on their own as a child because they were just expected to be pleasant and compliant as a child. And basically this person ended up with a lack of a sense that their own internal lived experience was valid, that what was valid was a narrative that existed outside of them. And it was really like starkly a form of oppression. And what we have worked on in the therapy is helping the person kind of contact their own, like what their own lived experience was, and to try to take that in as valid and to let that inform their choices as opposed to constantly trying to fit themselves into this narrative that was imposed on them from the outside. So yeah, I think that oppression is really real and happens not just on a macro level but on a micro level, and that part of therapy can be helping to free people, helping people to find a truth within their own lived experience, like their own sense in their own bodies and their own feelings about what is right and good for them. And often that goes against the grain of the narrative that they were raised with or the narrative of the culture at large. So I don't know if if that answers your question, but I can give you another example. It's a case that comes to mind of a client who, this is a case of the oppressiveness of the idea that having a mental health problem carries a stigma. So this was a person who battled major depression all their lives, at least since they were a young teenager, and was hiding it, going to great lengths to hide it and trying to project an image of positivity. And as a therapist, I was really finding it very hard to
They should
connect.
listen to my podcast.
They should. They would like your podcast a lot, actually. I was finding it hard to connect with this person, and a lot of the therapy in the first couple of years was about, if it wasn't something I was consciously working toward, but it just sort of happened organically, where the person had to really confront the tension between wanting to seem very positive and wanting to be liked for who they really were by me or by other people. And there was this tension between those two things that finally led the person to confront the fact that they were actually very depressed and suicidal, but and they were unable to hide it anymore. They were unable to continue to project this image. Like that broke down, their ability to continue projecting this facade. And what has happened is that they've become much more integrated and much more likable and much more real. And I think even though it's been hard for them to really face how depressed they've been and accept that and grapple with whether or not the stigma that attaches to that is really deserved, which of course it isn't. I mean, if the person had heart disease or kidney disease, nobody would think twice or think they were a bad person. And I use those analogies all the time. Mental health problems are physical problems. They have mental symptoms, but they're physical problems that should have no stigma any more than any other health problem. And, that was a kind of oppression coming from the societal narrative, going back to the idea that we should all be really happy and functional all the time and nothing should ever be hard, and if you're not really happy all the time, you're failing. And what this person found...
Well, I say, what's wrong with failure anyway?
well, that's the whole other thing.
Yeah.
What's wrong with failing? I mean, look at Babe Ruth, right? The classic example. He had the most home runs and the most strikeouts up to that point in the major
Yeah, or look at
leagues.
Dick Nixon. I mean, he ran for president over and over again.
There you go, and he finally got it.
And he finally got it!
And then he went down in flames.
Hooray for Dick!
Woo, but he ended up an elder statesman who was sort of beloved in a weird way, because he went to China, I guess. I don't know why. People forgot about the paranoia once he was out of office.
Yeah.
We want to love our kings here, But anyway, so those are two examples that come to mind of how these oppressive narratives, one from the Catholic Church, one from the culture at large about mental health stigma, really entrap people, and how that can be part of therapy is to examine those and find a way to to challenge them productively and come up with a more, okay, it sounds a little new agey, but a more authentic narrative, something that helps, that is more helpful to the person and is more real.
Well, I don't think, I feel like sometimes you apologize for being, quote, too new agey, unquote.
Well, it sounds that way coming out of my mouth in this context.
Well, when you're talking about this particular subject, I mean, you're talking about redemption, you're talking about leaps of faith, you're talking about, people discovering their own strength. I mean, these are things that don't fit into the American narrative. They don't fit into our cultural, the Constitution that we were given, right? Which is basically that if you're born rich, you should find happiness in power. And if you're not born rich, you should find happiness in service. And if you don't, then you're a cancer on the body politic.
Wow.
Right? And if you're a minority, then you should die quickly. Unless your labor is useful.
Go away quietly.
Right. And then you should die as slowly as possible so we can get you to work on.
So we can exploit you.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that so when you're talking about new agey stuff, I say at some point you just have to take a leap of faith. There's no other way to describe it. If you want to believe in yourself and you're finding it difficult to believe in yourself because you're depressed, you're never going to be able to locate enough external evidence to convince you that you are worthy of happiness, of success, of existence.
Well, that's part of why people go to therapy, because the therapist is a source of that external. It's a different point of view. It's a different perspective.
But not all you do, but a big part of what you do is you help people feel safe enough that they can feel that they can take the risk of trying to deal with this themselves.
Yeah.
That's true. You don't just tell people believe this and then they believe it.
No.
That seems like you probably don't tell people very much at all.
That's true.
You just ask questions and listen.
Some people complain about that.
People like to be
you
told
never
what
tell
to
me
do
what
sometimes.
to do.
Right. People do. People like to be told what to do sometimes, which can be frustrating.
Yeah, once in a while I tell people what to do, but only if I know them really well.
Yeah.
And even then, it's perilous. You can make mistakes and people, but that's okay.
Absolutely. I mean, you're taking a risk because you're taking ownership and agency in any such recommendation. If somebody desperately wants to do charity work, for example, and you tell them that they should get involved in charity. Like I know you mentioned sometimes you tell clients to get more politically activated so they can feel like they have a voice.
Yes.
Right? So they can discover their own strength, basically.
Yep.
Not so that you can impose strength on them,
right.
So they can discover what's already there, right? But even then you run the risk of they do it and it works, and then their narrative becomes, well, I only succeeded because Eliza told me.
I've had that happen where, I'll hear people say, I'll encourage people to look for somebody to date if they're feeling isolated. Then it becomes, well, I only did this because my therapist told me to. And it's like, whoa, that is not what I meant.
I would say that's awesome. Did your therapist tell you how many dates to wait before we have sex?
No.
I wouldn't say that, but I've been drinking this Big Bad Baptist Imperial Stout. This is some crunchy stuff right here.
Really, it's like dessert.
It is. It's like a very chocolatey, alcohol-y
We haven't
Imperial
eaten
Stout.
lunch or dinner yet, so.
We have not. We're going to go out to lunch after this, I think, and eat something that will... No, I'm lying. Well, I'm going to go out to lunch after this and have more to drink.
There you go.
Yes. Skol.
L'chaim.
L'chaim. To life and death.
I always have to express my Judaism somehow.
I love toasts. So we've arrived at
Is
this...
drinking a regular part of your podcast?
No.
Oh, interesting.
No. The idea is that people, maybe after they listen to the podcast, might need a drink. Right? But wisdom is best discovered... sometimes it's best discovered drunk, but it's never best communicated drunk. Let's put it that way.
Okay. We better finish up then.
Yeah, right? Well, I'm sure our audience is getting tired of hearing us ramble on, but I don't want to belabor the point either. I want to come back to my other point about what you're talking about, though. It seems like a lot of these narratives that people construct for themselves or that are even given to them by their parents are naturally occurring poisons, right? I mean,
I like that way of looking at it.
as sad as it is,
That's very interesting.
the desire of parents to control their children so as to live through them is pretty universal. So the degree to which, I mean, it's true, like maybe the way I characterize it is a reflection of the alcohol, but it's true that this parental authority, I'm always right, maybe it's oppressive and it's imposed from outside the child, but it also arises organically from just the dynamics of children. I mean, it would arise on its own, I think, in any culture that didn't actively guard against it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because parents just inherently have this desire.
Yeah.
Like, too much of their identity ends up being wrapped up in their children,
Yeah.
as you can probably relate to having a child.
I mean, parents become the tools of social oppression, I think, is part of what happens.
Yes, that's good. That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
Here's to parenting.
Here's the parenting. Ooh, let's be oppressive.
So, so that doesn't really have an analog in the political sphere with.
I think it does. You think of like the party elders, propagating a certain message because they have a certain outcome that they think is best for
True.
people.
True. I just meant that it's not the same thing as an industrial poison. Again, using my analogy.
Right.
It's not.
Well, I like that way of looking at
It's
it.
not intentionally designed. Like, no parent intends to inflict despair.
That's actually
on
a
their children.
really compassionate way of looking at it that I like. I like that a lot. I'm gonna integrate that.
Oh, good.
I think that'll help people.
That's right. Hey, that's the purpose of Grim Wisdom, is we want to help people by opening their minds to dark truths. But,
Yeah.
I think that
So yeah, right.
no parent really, even in like, if you take it to the ridiculous extreme of honor killings, even in cultures where parental oppression goes to that extreme, right? I'm sure that the parents don't want to kill their children. They don't want their kids to suffer. They just feel like they have no choice at that point, right? And if they truly did have no choice, right? If it was a situation where there was actually no other choice, I mean, some extreme situation, then you could see it, right? Like, you save one of the kids and let the other one die because you
I
can't save one.
really admire that you can look at it that way. I think especially in this age of Islamophobia, the fact that you can kind of see it from the parents' point of view and how they might be between a rock and a hard place
Well,
is pretty admirable.
evil arises organically from the nature of what we are. There's a great. I mean, I don't like to talk too much about animal studies or animal behavior because I think it promotes too base of an understanding of what we are, because we're not just animals. But there's a great nature documentary I was just watching about snow monkeys in Japan. Well, snow monkeys, they're furry and they can stand really cold up in the Japanese Alps, but it's cold there. And there's this one hot springs, which is this nice balmy temperature year round in the depths of winter, right? And all these snow monkeys, they want to get in the hot springs, but only the elite, only the females and infants of the right bloodlines are allowed to use the pool, right? Only those who descend
Whoa.
from the leaders of the tribe, and a few of the guards, right? Like the male guards might fight off, like as a reward for fighting off any of the rabble, any of the peasants. They get to spill over the pool. But sitting around the pool, like sort of trying to absorb whatever warmth they have, are all these sad-looking snow monkeys who are like huddled together, freezing, watching their superiors bask in the pool. And if you watch that, you're like, man, oh man, if I was one of those snow monkeys, I would burn this mother to the ground. But even that isn't a perfect example, because ultimately those people sitting outside the pool, their females might mate with the right males in another generation and gain access to the pool. Like their DNA might enter the pool someday, even if they don't, right? So it's not a perfect analogy for human oppression, but even like evil is innate, oppression arises organically from human selfishness, human lack of empathy,
Yeah,
right? And so
I like that way of looking at it.
So, the depths of cruelty implied in like the most horrific forms of evil, what's so evil about them is not the acts themselves, it's that they are institutional, it's that they are antiseptic.
They
it's
get
their-
institutionalized.
Right. It's like what's bad what is so horrifying about the Holocaust,
Right.
and you, of course, may have a different perspective on this,
I'm sure.
but what to me is so horrifying about the Holocaust is not the number of people dead, or even the fact that it was genocide. It was the sheer institutional
Yes.
mundanity of it.
There was an article recently about someone who was like a middle level employee in the Holocaust who said it was just another job. I
Yeah,
mean, I think that sums it up.
right. It was just
The-
another job.
The banality of evil, as they say.
Yes, you know,
Yeah.
and that is
But
horrifying
that's,
to me.
you know, shows a real lack of critical thinking, you know, that
Yes.
somebody could regard it that way. That it's like country over all else. If your country tells you to kill people, well, that's
Yes.
just what you do.
Deutschland über alles.
That's right.
Right, but yeah, I mean it's just but there's something in your nature. I mean, unless you lack all empathy, like the thing is, empathy is also innate. Your ability to feel
I
compassion.
think there's a genetic component that enables some people to feel it more than others.
That's probably true.
Yeah.
But I do also think it can be trained and developed.
I think so.
In the same sense as like there's certainly a genetic component to being a world class athlete.
Yes.
Right, but and also a large amount of steroids that need to be taken. But that doesn't
Number of
mean
natural gifts that are just naturally occurring.
right. But that doesn't mean that you can't improve your strength and prowess through
Yeah.
practice and exercise.
Mhm.
Right, and I think the same thing applies to empathy. Right,
Yeah.
there may be people who simply can't feel empathy, or
I
whose,
think that's true.
whose genetic capacity for it is lesser or greater. But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean we all can't develop it. And in the absence of empathy, that is the only thing that prevents that from happening. Because you got to know when it's your job to put people into ovens. If you have any compassion at all,
Yeah.
your compassion is screaming at you, this is evil, this is wrong,
Yeah.
right? And like, if your society tells you, if your society validates that voice of empathy,
Yeah.
then you won't put people into ovens. But if your society crushes that feeling of empathy, it others
Mm-hmm.
everybody, right? Then you're capable of putting people into ovens, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's so sick about American society is we take the latter route, right? We say deafen your empathy, right? And like if I'm trying to persuade you to empathize with me, right? I don't bother to explain to you in detail in the political realm. If you want to have a political conversation about empathy, I don't bother to explain to you as a person all the details of what I came about because that's not effective. It's simply not effective. People try it all the time. It doesn't work. The only way it works is if I explain to you how I can relate to you, how what happened to me has some analog in your life, right? Because that's how badly our facility for empathy has been stifled rather than encouraged by our society, is that we're actually led to believe that that's how you should experience everybody's
Wow.
life, is that you should only ever experience it through the lens of your own experiences. And if you've never been raped, then obviously you can't understand what rape is like. It's just self-evident that
Well,
you
if
don't
that was
understand
true,
it.
I'd be out of business. But
It's true. Well, I mean, it's not true, but that's what cultural
Yeah.
programming tells you to think, right? And it's amazing to me how many people will grow up and be leftists even and hate and truly despise evil, truly feel a real desire to oppose things like the Holocaust, and yet not have that ability to feel empathy imaginatively, if you will, to
Yeah.
feel empathy for people whose experience is wholly foreign to their own,
yeah,
right? Like in honor killings, for example, to get back to
yeah,
earlier.
that's interesting.
So we are out of time, and we've been interrupted by Eliza's charming wife and daughter. So we're gonna let this go. But I think that so far it's been pretty grim. I want to let you, if you have anything horrible that you
Have
want.
I been grim enough?
I think you have. I think that the
I think
alcohol
I
has made
skew
you a
you
little.
in a more idealistic direction.
Well,
I think I bring out the hopefulness in you. I'm sorry to say. Sorry to all the listeners who were hoping for something more grim.
I'm sorry I couldn't deliver something good this week. I
think
had to get
I've
Eliza. Yeah.
disappointed them yet again.
Well, I think this will be another podcast where people
It'll be
people be like,
polarized.
that was really good. You know, I really learned a lot, and have people be like, that sucked.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. Well, that's the response I'm looking for.
That's so funny.
You have any last thoughts before we close out?
I just appreciate you wanting to have a conversation. I enjoy
Aw.
talking to you.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Eliza, but maybe I'm just saying that because of the beer. So on that note, thank you all for listening, and we will see you next week.